Good morning. Everybody has source sheets. I apologize for the lack of English translation, and we'll just go through it and translate as we go along. So the whole topic of Shemitah is really rich in idealism. Everybody sharing, everybody having a physical and spiritual sabbatical. It's good for the land, it's good for the nation. The idealism of the Torah is especially evident in the laws and idea of Shmitat Ksafim, as we see in excerpt number 1. So let's take a look at excerpt number 1 in Devarim Tetvav. Miketz Sheva Shanim Ta'aseh Shemitah. At the end of 7 years, you'll make a remission of loans, a specific kind of dropping of loans at the end of the Shemitah year. V'zeh dvar hashmitah. This is how the remission works. Shamot kol ba'al mashe yado asher yashev b're'ehu. If you can imagine a lender standing with the person who borrowed the money beside him, the lender has to physically drop his hand, right? Shamot et yado shel kol ba'al mashe. The person asking for the money back has to drop his hand. Lo yigose re'ehu v'ed achiv. He can't demand the money back from his brother. Ki kara Shemitah laHashem, because it is a remission year for Hashem. Et hanochri tigos. The non-Jew you can demand your money back from, or even according to some of Farshim, you must demand your money back from. But as for your Jewish brother, your hand has to drop. So the ideal here of Shemitah Ksafim is that if there's a personal loan between one Jew and another, and the Shemitah year comes, at the end of the Shemitah year, at the end, Erev Rosh Hashanah, at the end of the Shemitah year, so that'll be upcoming Rosh Hashanah, if there's a personal loan between two Jews, the loan is over. The person no longer owes you any money. And the idea behind this is that if you didn't have money to return the loan before the Shemitah year began, how will you have money to return the loan after the Shemitah year? Because you haven't really earned money during the Shemitah year. Everybody's managed and shared and had what they needed, but nobody's really profiting during the Shemitah year. So where are you going to get the money from to buy the seeds to plant your upcoming fields if you still have outstanding debts from before the Shemitah year? So that's perhaps the wisdom behind the idea. So the end of the Shemitah year gives everybody a peace, all the debtors, a peace. They don't have to return their personal loans. And Hashem warns us in Pasuk Tet in Excerpt 1, Hishamer lecha. Watch yourself, because God knows how we think, right? You might see as the Shemitah year is approaching, we're in year 5, year 6, and you're thinking he needs money from me, but what's the likelihood that he's going to pay the money back before the Shemitah year? It's year 5. From year 5 on, I'm not lending any more money. That's it, because I don't trust that I'm going to get it back. Hashem knows we're going to think that way. Hashem warns us. Watch it. Don't think that way. Naton titein lo. You give him. V'lo yira levavcha betitcha lo. And don't feel bad about giving him either. Don't do it in a harsh way either. Ki biglal hadavar hazeh yivarecha Hashem Elokecha. God will bless you because of doing this. So this is an amazing ideal of the Shemitah year, of this idea of Shemitah Ksafim. And in fact, this keta in Sefer Devarim, this section, is really rich in repetitive language, in moral and halachic guidelines, and many of the psukim, some of them that I skipped out with the ... are the psukim that teach us how to give charity in general. Be exceedingly gracious, be concerned about their mental status, their spiritual status, their emotional status, lend as opposed to give a gift, because it's more respectful if you tell them we expect that you're going to give the money back. So there's all sorts of guidelines in this keta. It's a really important section of Chumash, and it has a huge expectation of us to lend money and not expect to get it back, personal loans. So the Rambam in excerpt number 2 points out that nowadays it is dirabanan, as actually the mitzvah of Shemitah of the land is also considered derabanan still nowadays. And but this applies not only in Eretz Yisrael, it applies everywhere. Shemitah Ksafim applies to all of us everywhere. So we're all going to be faced with this. Those of us who have lent money or borrowed money will all be faced with this as Rosh Hashanah approaches, the coming Rosh Hashanah. In Seif Tet Vav, the Rambam tells us, however, we learn something from the language of the Torah where it says, Asher yelecha et achicha, the loan that you have with your brother. So Seif Tetvav says, Hamoser shtarotav leBeit Din. If you give your loan documents over to the Beit Din, ve'omer lahem atem gavu li chovizeh, and you say to the Beit Din, you take care of this loan for me, eino nishmat. That loan does not get canceled at the end of Shemitah, because the Torah says the loan that you have with your brother, BAYT, and this loan would be through BAYT, an institution, not your brother, and therefore the idea of Shemitah Ksafim would not apply to an institutional loan to an individual, just a personal loan from one individual to another. So what happened? This idea led to the takana that was made by Hillel, called prosbul, that probably you're familiar with, in Seif Tetzayin. Kishara'a Hillel hazaken shenimneu milahalvot ze'etza. When Hillel saw that as the Shemitah year approached, year 5, year 6, whatever, people stopped giving loans. The wealthier people stopped giving loans because they were worried that exactly what God warned against in Pasuk Tet, people were worried that they weren't going to get their money back. When Hillel saw that it happened, people were going against Hashem's warning not to do it. Hitkin prosbul. He made a takana. Now, what's a takana? A takana is like an amendment to a law made by the Rabbanim to fix, a nice way of putting it from Rav Ephraim Orbach is to fix ivut shenitaveh b'halacha, to fix a distortion of the law in the Torah. The law of the Torah was meant for us to do amazing, super chesed, and what happened? We refrained from doing basic, appropriate chesed by giving loans. So this obviously was a distortion of Hashem's goal in the Torah. So Hillel thought that by putting in this takana of prosbul, this takana to the wealthy people to still give the loans, but you'll be able to get them back, because what do? You, before Shemitah year ends, you sign a document through the Beit Din, and you can download it, easily from many websites nowadays. You sign the loan. The loan now, instead of being from Mr. A to Mr. B, the loan goes from Mr. A to the Beit Din, and from Beit Din to Mr. B. And that's how the idea of Shemitah Ksafim has been amended so that people will still continue to give loans. Does it fit with the ideal of the Torah? Drop the loan? Obviously not. Does it fit with the ideal of the Torah to do basic chesed? Obviously yes. So nonetheless, the Rambam goes on and tells us that if you had a loan and it was dropped because the prosbul wasn't done, then if you want to give the loan back, of course you can give the loan back after Shemitah year is over. Simply when you're giving it back, you're saying, I'm giving it as a gift. I know I'm not obligated to. And the lender says, you're not obligated. I know, but nonetheless, I'm giving it as a gift. And then Rambam reiterates to us in Seif Lamed, if you refrain from giving loans before the Shemitah because you're worried you're not going to get it back, I guess this is before people were using the prosbul. Just remember, it is a huge sin that you're going against the ideal of the Torah, that people are meant to lend when they have the money. Remember the whole idea, and that's actually what Rav Rimon says in excerpt number 3. The whole idea, and Beit Din, by doing it through Beit Din, you're still maintaining this idea. The whole idea is to remember that when you have excess money, and you could give a loan, you have to remember that where's that excess money coming from? That excess money is a gift to you from God, your good fortune, your good business, your whatever. Rav Rimon says, Tam hadavar muvan, im mevinim she'ikar ha'inyan shel shmitat ha'ksafim novea me'ha'isur laha'arot ba'alut al ha'mamon. The idea of shmitat ksafim is that you show that you aren't the owner of that money. You have the money now by the grace of God. Be willing to give it to somebody else, because ultimately God is the owner of everything. This idea of ownership is really key in the whole topic of Shemitah. So we have this idea of prosbul, which enables us to, yes, get our money back. It's very practical takana. It helps us lending. Does it live up to the real ideal of the Torah to drop the loan and do that unbelievable chesed to your fellow Jew? Well, not necessarily. Well, let's go on. Let's look at the idea of Shmitat Karkaot, the Shemitah of the land that we're in right now in Israel. So here's a basic excerpt from Vayikra, from Behar. Hashem says to Moshe, Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem. So this is excerpt number 4 on the bottom of page 1. Ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem v'shavta haaretz Shabbat laHashem. The land will have a sabbatical year for Hashem. Shesh shanim tizra sadecha. For 6 years you plant your field. Shesh shanim tizmor karmecha. For 6 years you prune your vineyard. Ve'asavta et tvuata. You collect its produce. V'shana hashviit Shabbat Shabbaton yeh la'aretz Shabbat laHashem. It's a sabbatical year in the 7th year. Now here are the 4 specific isurim, the prohibitions of Shemitah. Sadcha lo tizra, you don't plant your field. Karmecha lo tizmor, you don't prune your vineyard. Etzviach kitzircha lo tiktzor, the stuff that grows on its own because you haven't planted, but the stuff that's grown anyhow from what's dropped off from the year or something like from the year before, you don't harvest. Et invei nizirecha lo titzor, you don't gather the grapes that grew on the unpruned vines. It's a sabbatical year to the land, for the land. But pasuk vav, very important, v'hayita Shabbat haaretz lachem le'ochla. However, you can still eat the produce, which means if you can still eat the produce, you still have to remove it from the trees, right? It says you can't pick your vineyard, but you still have to pick the stuff to eat. So this is going to be an important point in the halacha. So who gets to eat it? Your servant, your worker, your paid worker, the strangers among you, your animals, everybody. Tzvuata le'echol. The food is meant to be eaten, but obviously there's limitations, and certainly you can't treat it like you're the owner of it, because everybody gets to share it. Okay. So there is a distinction between the first 2 isurim of planting and pruning and the second 2 of picking the produce, because you do need to eat the produce. The Tosefta in number 5, which is material from the Mishnaic time that didn't get into the Mishnah, tells us how it worked in those days. Barishona hayu shluchei beitin yoshvim al pitchei ayarot. At the beginning, the representatives of the beitin would sit at the entrance to the cities. If you brought fruit that you had removed from your yard, from your field, they would take it from you because you don't own it, right? You don't own it in the Shemitah year. You would receive back enough for 3 meals for you to eat and your family to eat, no more. So you don't have to run back before every meal, but you have enough for a day. The rest would be put in the treasury of the city, and everybody would come and everybody would take from it. Higiaz man te'enim, when it was time to harvest the figs, shluchei beitin, sochrim po'alim, the representatives of beitin would hire workers who would go, they would pick the figs, they would make develot, they would make like fig cakes from them or whatever they make from them, they would put them in big containers, they would bring it back to Otsar Shabair, to the treasury in the city. When it was time for the grapes, representatives of beitin would hire workers, and they would pick the grapes, and they would press the grapes, and make the grape juice, and make the wine, and put it in containers, and bring it back to the treasury in the city. And when it was time for the olives, they would do the same thing, bring them, press them into oil, etc., bring it to the beitin, and then mechalkim mehem arvei shabbatot kol echad ve'echad levi beito, and you would go once a week to go to the beitin and get the produce that you were entitled to, that everybody in the city was entitled to, because nobody owns it. The beitin is distributing it to you for the purpose of everybody enjoying. But hired workers would pick the stuff so that it could be picked, so that people could eat it. The Ramban explains it also, and he just adds, we'll just look at the bold on the bottom in excerpt number 6, V'kol zo ha'takana v'hatorach shel beitin, all this was the takana, the amendment, and the effort of beitin, mipnei chashad shelo yavo la'akvem o la'asot mehem schora, because of a concern that the owners should not hold back some of the fruit for themselves and eat it beyond the time when it was allowed for them to eat it, or perhaps they would do business with the fruit and sell the fruit. So the beitin is protecting the people from behaving inappropriately, and the beitin sort of becomes responsible for the produce. Rav Kook suggested the reestablishment of this Otzar Beitin. So this Otzar Beitin happened in the times of the Mishnah, but over the past 1,000 years, it didn't really happen. Until Rav Kook suggested it, the establishment of this idea of Otzar Beitin in the year 1909-1910, during that Shemitah year, but it really wasn't instituted until the year 1944-45, that Shemitah year in Israel, and to a greater extent it was instituted in 1951-52 by the Chazon Ish. So Rav Rimon talks about the Chazon Ish in number 7, and he says, "L'divrei haChazon Ish," in the Chazon Ish, according to Chazon Ish, "Isur haktsira hakayam b'shmita hu rak b'yachas labe'alim." The prohibition of harvesting relating to Shemitah year really relates only to the owners. The owners can't be the ones who are harvesting. V'lachen pe'ulot elu mutarot be'emtzaut shlichim shel Beit Din. So these activities of harvesting the fruit are allowed by representatives of Beit Din. Matam hadavar, how is that possible? If the Torah says you can't harvest, how can you can harvest but you can't harvest? הרעיון היסודי שאותו מביאה שמיטה לידי ביטוי הוא כי לי כל הארץ. The basic idea of Shemitah is that li kol haaretz, the whole land belongs to me, to God, and to nobody else. Kolomar, Kadosh Baruch Hu be'alim ala karka v'lo anachnu. God is the owner of the land. We aren't the owner of the land. V'nigud l'zriya u'zmira, as opposed to planting and pruning, shehen malachot shene'esru ba'atzmotan b'shmitah, the Chazon Ish feels that planting and pruning were forbidden in and of themselves completely during Shemitah year. כנראה שקצירה ובצירה נאסרו בגלל התוצאות שהן מובילות עליהם. But harvesting and picking the fruit were forbidden because of the result that the harvesting or picking would bring when the vineyard is in your property and you're harvesting it. What's your natural nitiyah? Your natural tendency will be to say, "No, this is my fruit." And that specifically you'll feel when you're harvesting your fruit. So b'milim acherot, in other words, he says, "En isur litzor v'litzor b'shmita." It's not prohibited to harvest fruit, to pick fruit in Shemitah. Ha'isur b'mlachot elu hu b'ba'alut ala karka shehen mafkinot. It's the sense of ownership on the property that harvesting implies. Therefore, if you're not doing the harvesting, if Beit Din is doing the harvesting, we have no problem with Shemitah. And that's Chazon Ish's amendment, his idea, not his, I mean, it's based on the Tosefta, of why it's acceptable for Beit Din to do the harvesting, and you can still harvest fruit during the Shemitah year. There's no sense of ownership, because Beit Din is responsible. The owner really isn't paid. The workers are paid for their labor. Everybody seems to win. The people eat the produce, that's us. And the advantage, as Rav Rimon said when he was here last month, we have this incredible advantage of eating Kedushat Shvi'it, fruit that has this holiness to it that's so special, it's such a mitzvah that you're consuming when you consume it. Is the ideal of the Torah still taking place? Because the land isn't necessarily laying fallow, the workers are still picking the fruit is still being distributed to the stores. As a consumer, if I go shopping, I'm going to ask my children in Israel, is your shopping so differently? And they say, no, we just look for the sign. Just look for the sign. We're still shopping as usual, right? As long as you watch your hashgacha signs, you're still having business as usual to a certain extent because you're still paying for your fruit. So really, yes, you're eating Shemitah fruit, yes, and you're being very careful when it's Perot Shvit, how you dispose of it, etc., and how you consume it. But the business angle of it, everything's free, everything's open in Shemitah year, we're all sharing, you're still going to the supermarket and paying for your fruit during Shemitah year. So, are we living up to the ideal of the Torah, especially when you factor in heter mechira, that we're not going to talk about now, but it's based along the same lines, that you're taking the Torah law and you're amending it using, rabbinic law, heter mechira, the land is sold to a non-Jew, and therefore the laws of Shemitah don't apply to it anymore because it's owned by a non-Jew now. Again, Prosbol instead of Shemitah Ksafim, Otzar Beit Din, or to a greater extent Heter Mechira, instead of the land lay fallow. Are we going against the Torah by seeking out these practices? To the list we could add Mechira Chametz. We sell our Chametz before Pesach so that maybe we don't have to empty out our liquor cabinet, down the toilet. Heter Iska, that a loan that you can't give with interest to a Jew. It's not really a loan, it's really an investment in that Jew, so the laws of rebate, of interest don't apply anymore. These are things that we do nowadays all the time. So are we going against the Torah here? So Rav Rimon explains in excerpt number 8, by way of an analogy, I think it's a very nice analogy. He says, Ka'asher avaryan menatzel pirtza b'chok. when a criminal takes advantage of a gap in the fence that is a law. המחוקק קובע מיד תיקון לחוק, כדי לסתום את הפרצה שבה המחוקק הראשון לא הבחין. The subsequent lawgiver will quickly add a new law or amend the law to close up the gap that the initial lawmaker didn't notice. לכן כל חוק אנושי בנוי מתיקוני חוק רבים שנועדו לסתום פרצות. So human law is made up of a lot of additions to laws and amendments to laws that were built and put in and added as years passed to close up any gaps that became evident in laws as years went by. אולם האם ניתן להתייחס כך לפרצה שנמצאת בתורה? But is that how we would relate to a gap, an opening that's in the Torah? Chas v'shalom, right? God forbid. בחוק אזרחי, in civil law, לו היה שם לב המחוקק שבעתיד ינצלו פרצה מסוימת בחוק, מה היה עושה? In civil law, if the lawmaker would know that in advance somebody would take advantage of this language, this opening, right, to manipulate and get around getting punished, what would he do? He would obviously close that gap from the beginning and not allow that gap to happen. He wouldn't leave that gap that's calling out to the thief, come, take advantage, and you'll be able to get out of this in court. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tzofeh ulam HaKadosh Baruch Hu tzofeh adidot v'yodeh nistarot. But God knows everything. God knows the future. Im yesh pirtza b'Torah, i'afshar lomar sheKadosh Baruch Hu lo chashav al kach merosh. If there's a gap in the Torah, you can't say that God didn't think of it in advance. Im yesh pirtza b'Torah, harei shehaTorah hish'ira et ha'pirtza b'kavana, kedei shetziyeh menutzelet b'zman hamatim. If there was a gap left in Torah law, obviously God left it there so it could be used in the future. And furthermore, Rav Rimon says, Nidmesha HaTorah on page 3, HaTorah rotza lelamed otanu, the Torah wants to teach us, shebematzav ragil aleinu lekayem et hamitzvah kipshuta. In a normal situation, of course we're supposed to keep the law according to the pshat of the law. Ulam yodad HaTorah sheyavo yom b'yet tzorech litaken heter mechira, prospo mechirat chametz o heter iska. But the Torah knows that one day will come and there will be a need to make the amendment of the heter mechira, of the prospo, of mechirat chametz or heter iska. V'lachen hi hish'ira pirtza sheta'afsher zot. So God left these gaps in the Torah so that these amendments would be able to be made from them. I think it really relates to a much bigger discussion about the relationship between Torah shebichtav and Torah Shebe'al Peh. Let's look at a vastly different example, totally different example. Look, we have several crimes in the Torah, including murder, where the penalty listed is death, mot yumat. And so one would think that therefore, even though all of B'nai Israel are always tzaddikim, and we've always been tzaddikim, that, we would see examples of the death penalty being carried out in the Gemara, in our history. And yet, the Mishnah says in excerpt number 9, Sanhedrin hahoreget echad b'shavua nikret choblanit. A Sanhedrin that would carry out capital punishment once in 7 years is considered, oh my God, a murderous Sanhedrin. Whoa, in 7 years they killed someone. Oh, that doesn't happen, right? And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah omer echad l'shivim shana. No. You're murderous if you do it once in 70 years. So rare was capital punishment done. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva say, Ilu hayina b'Sanhedrin lo ne'arag adam me'olam. Well, if we would be in Sanhedrin, nobody would ever get killed. And Shimon ben Gamliel says, Apen marbim shochet damim b'Yisrael. That's not so good, because there's no deterrent effect then if you don't see someone once in 70 years getting killed for murder. That will set aside. But why is it that death penalty was given so rarely in the times of the Sanhedrin? We could say everybody was tzaddikim, but let's be realistic, right? Not likely. So it has to do with the laws of hatra'ah, the laws of what needs to happen before somebody can be punished with the death penalty. So there need to be two eidim, two witnesses to have observed the crime, but also the criminal needs to have been warned by the laws of hatra'ah. So if you look at halacha bet in the Rambam in excerpt number 10, you get a sense of how picky the laws of hatra'ah are. So whether you're Talmid Chacham, whether you're an Am Ha'aretz, you need Hatra'ah, because the idea of Hatra'ah is to make sure that the crime was done intentionally and not unintentionally. Now, how do we make sure that the crime is done totally intentionally, and then you really deserve Onesh Mavet, like the death penalty for it? Ketzad Matrim Bo? How did they warn him? Omrim Lo Prosh O Al Ta'aseh Shezo Averahi. They said to him, no, don't do it. That's a sin. If you do it, you'll either get lashed or you'll get killed by Beit Din. Im peresh patur. If the guy stops and doesn't do the crime, obviously he's exempt from punishment. V'chen im shatak o hirchin berosho. If he was quiet, sort of to imply that he heard it, o hirchin berosho, he nodded with his head, but he still commits the crime. He's still patur. He's still exempt from punishment. That's not considered full warning. Afilo amar yodea ani. Even if he says, I know, and then he goes ahead and kills, he's still patur. He still doesn't get killed by Beit Din. It's still not considered full punishment. Ad sheyatir atzmo lemita. Until he himself gives himself the warning back, ve'omer almanat ken ani oseh. I know I'm doing it. I know I'm going to get the death penalty, and nonetheless, in spite of that, I'm committing the crime. Then yehareg. Then he will get killed by Beit Din, but only if no time lapsed at all between him saying, I know it's a crime, I know I'm going to get the death penalty for it, and nonetheless, I'm still doing the crime, stab. Right? If any dibur, if any time lapses between, I know, and again, whatever, pause, a moment passes, then he commits the crime, then he's exempt again. Because, well, maybe he had a change of mind in his mind, whatever. The laws of Hatra'ah are so picky in the Gemara that this idea in the Torah, mot yumat, isn't likely going to be carried out in reality. The Torah establishes a law and a punishment for breaking the law, but the Torah Sheba'al Peh eases its implementation. As in Otzar Beit Din, Prosbul, a stringent law in the Torah becomes more relaxed because of what's written in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, it works in the other direction as well. Just as we have takanot, which ease a halacha, amend a halacha, depending on the generation, we have gezerot, decrees, that tighten a halacha. As the Gemara says regarding Hilchot Shabbat, if you take a look in excerpt number 11, Hilchot Shabbat, Chagigot, Me'ilot, the laws of Shabbat, the laws of the Korban Chagiga, the festival Korban, Me'ilot, the laws of inappropriate use of sanctified things for the Beit Midrash, Hekdesh, Harehem Kehararim Hatzluim B'Sa'ara. They are like mountains hanging by a hair. Shehen Mikra Mu'at, just a little bit of Torah text about them, the halachot merubot, and many rabbinic halachot, many gzerot, shvuyot, that we know about certainly in Hilchot Shabbat, limiting the basic Torah law. So really, even though it's moving in the opposite direction of the takanot, right, tightening, it's for the same reason as the takanot, to maintain the integrity of the halachic system and to help us observe the law appropriately. The beauty here is that it shows the partnership between the Torah Shebichtav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, between God and what God gave to man. He gave both to man, but what he put more in the hands of man. As the Ritva says, and Rav Rimon quotes it in his book on Shemitah, the Ritva in excerpt number 12, regarding the disagreements of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, says in the Gemara, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both these and these are the words of the living God, the opinion of Hillel, Beit Hillel, the opinion of Beit Shammai. Sha'alu Rabbanei Tzorfat Zal, so the rabbis of France asked, He'ach shar shiyu shnehem divrei Elokim Chaim. How can they both be simultaneously the words of the living God? Ze oser v'ze matir. This one says it's forbidden, this one says it's permitted. V'tertzu ki kisha'ala Moshe lamarom. They explained that when Moshe went up to Shamayim, lekabel Torah, to get the Torah, her'ulo al kol davar v'davar memtet panim le'isur v'memtet panim le'heter. They showed Moshe 49 ways to make the same thing forbidden and 49 ways to make it permitted. V'sha'al HaKadosh Baruch Hu al zeh. And God asked Hashem about that. And Moshe asked Hashem about that. And Hashem said, Yehei ze masur lechachmei Yisrael shebechol dor vador. That will be handed to the hands of Chachmei Yisrael in every generation. V'yeh hachra'ah k'motam. And they will make the decision. Rav Amital writes in excerpt number 13, Rabbi Kook remarked that the Kabbalah designates the written Torah as Papa and the oral Torah as Mama. Father and mother both pursue the same aims in the education of their children, only the father does it in his manner and the mother in hers. And both manners are needed if the child's education is to be complete. Sometimes the child needs the father's stern reprimand that does not consider extenuating circumstances, and at the same time needs the motherly tenderness, mercy, and understanding. The question is asked, if, as the oral law says, an eye for an eye means money for an eye, why does the written Torah say at all an eye for an eye rather than money for an eye? The answer is the written Torah is the father sternly declaring an eye for an eye. Then along comes the oral Torah as a clement mother saying, okay, it isn't that simple. It isn't really an eye for an eye. It actually means money for an eye. But revulsion at causing bodily harm is generated precisely by the written Torah's harsh prescription. There is educational value to the Torah's emphatic repetition, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a foot for a foot. We need the idealism of the Torah Shebichtav. Cancel your debts. Give your land and yourselves a total Shabbat. Or the strict demands of the Torah Shebichtav. Behave appropriately, or mot yumat. This level of idealism and expectation is essential to keep us reaching and striving higher, even as we have the takanot and the gzerot, which sometimes redefine how we keep the law. The beauty of the system is that it is dynamic. The chachamim in each generation are empowered to collaborate with God and to shape Torah law to evolve with our generations. This enables us to live lives that are forward-moving. We're not sadukim tied to the past of the Torah. We move forward with the Torah Shebe'al Peh, but we still live lives consistent with the stated expectations and the ideals of God's Torah. So let's enjoy the fruit of Otzar Beitin. If we have the zchut to be in Israel this year, let's enjoy the fruit of our learning. Have a wonderful week.